Ceres hadn't expected the end to arrive on a Tuesday. It was raining, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the village path to mud and made the herbs in her window box droop under the weight of the water. She was kneeling on the cottage floor, wiping porridge from her son's chin while he squirmed and protested, with a full theatrical fury that only a nearly 3-year-old boy could summon. "Hold still, Emmerich," she murmured, catching his jaw gently between her fingers. "You've got it in your eyebrow. How did you get porridge in your eyebrow?" Emmerich did not answer this question. He twisted free and bolted for the door with a shriek of delight, his curls bouncing, and Sarah's lunged after him with the cloth still in her hand. That was when she heard it. Hooves. Not one horse. Many. Moving fast along the northern road, the sound cutting through the rain like a blade. Ceres froze. Her hand closed around Emmerich's arm, and she pulled him behind her on instinct, her body placing itself between the door and the boy before her mind had caught up with her fear. Nobody rode the northern road at speed. Thornfeld was the kind of village that travelers passed through without stopping. A handful of stone cottages along a river crossing, too small to appear on most maps. That was why she had chosen it. That was why she had stayed. The hooves slowed, stopped, voices, low, clipped commands, the jingle of bridles, the heavy thud of boots hitting wet ground. Ceres moved to the window, her heart climbing into her throat, and looked out through the rain-streaked glass. Soldiers, 6 of them, armored in dark leather, dismounting in the clearing beside the old mill, and on every saddlecloth, stitched in silver thread, the sigil of the Valdrin crown. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Ceres gripped the windowsill hard enough to whiten her knuckles. She could feel the blood draining from her face, could feel the prickling rush of adrenaline flooding her arms and legs and making everything sharp and too bright. Every nightmare she'd had for the past 1,000 nights was playing out on the other side of that glass. The soldiers, dismounting, the sigil gleaming wet in the rain, the careful, purposeful way they scanned the village, checking doors and counting cottages. They were looking for someone. She knew exactly who. She'd always woken up before the soldiers reached her door. This time she was already awake. "Mama?" Emmerich tugged at her skirt. She looked down at him and her stomach dropped. His eyes, wide and curious and completely unafraid, were the precise gray of a winter sky just before snow. His father's eyes. Anyone who had ever stood in Soren Valdrin's presence would recognize those eyes in a heartbeat. "We're going to play a game," Ceres whispered, scooping him up. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "We're going to be very quiet and go out the back door. And we're going to walk quickly to Aunt Marin's cottage. Can you do that for Mama?" Emmerich nodded, sensing her fear, the way children always do, his small face suddenly solemn. She didn't waste time gathering belongings. There was nothing in this cottage worth more than the boy in her arms. She moved to the back door, eased it open with one hand, and stepped into the rain, and stopped. A man stood in her garden motionless, the rain soaking into the shoulders of his dark coat. He was facing away from her, his head tilted slightly, studying the line of herbs she'd planted along the fence. His hands hung at his side. He was very still in the way that only dangerous men could be still, the kind of stillness that came from absolute control over a body designed for violence. He was taller than she remembered. Ceres couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. Her wolf, dormant for years, slammed against the inside of her ribs with a recognition so violent it nearly buckled her knees. Every nerve in her body fired at once, half screaming at her to run, and half screaming at her to stay, and the contradiction locked her in place like a hand around her throat. Soren turned. The rain caught in his dark hair and ran in rivulets down his jaw. His face was harder than it had been when she'd last seen it, leaner, the bones sharper, the shadows beneath his eyes deeper. He looked like a man who had not stopped fighting since the day she'd left. The years had carved something austere into his features, stripping away whatever softness had once lived there and leaving behind only granite and grief. His gaze found hers, And for one terrible, suspended moment, the world went absolutely silent. The rain, the wind, the sound of her own pulse, everything just stopped. Then Emmerich shifted in her arms, turned his head to look at the stranger in the garden. Soren's eyes dropped to the boy. Saris watched it happen, watched the exact instant that recognition hit. She saw it move through him like a shockwave, stripping away the composure, the authority, the carefully constructed control that held the Alpha King together. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like something had been torn out of him. His lips parted. His hands, those steady, controlled hands, began to tremble. His gaze snapped back to hers. And in it she saw something she had never seen on the Alpha King's face. In all the time she had known him, he looked shattered. Ceres. Her name came out of him like a wound, raw and wrecked and disbelieving. The boy in her arms looked up at her. "Mama, who is that man?" Ceres couldn't answer. Her throat had closed completely. She held Emmerich tighter and stared at the father of her child through the rain, and for the first time since she'd fled the palace, she had absolutely nowhere left to run. 3 years earlier. The Royal Archive of Valdrin smelled the way knowledge should smell. Old paper and binding glue, and the faint sweetness of cedar shelves that had been standing longer than any living person could remember. Saris loved it. She loved the silence of it, the order, the way each scroll and ledger had a place and a purpose. She loved that the archive didn't care who she was or where she came from. It only cared whether she could do the work. And she could do the work. She'd been the archive's junior cartographer for just over a year, mapping trade routes and correcting survey errors for the Crown Council's Border Commission. It was quiet, meticulous work that suited her perfectly. She had no family name, no lands, no bloodline worth noting. She'd been raised at the Thornhaven Foundling House until she was old enough to apprentice, and she'd worked her way into the palace through sheer stubbornness and an unusual talent for reading terrain. Nobody important knew her name, and she preferred it that way. The morning everything changed. She was correcting a survey error in the Greymark border maps. The previous cartographer had misplotted a river crossing by nearly half a league, which meant the supply route marked on the council's campaign map ran directly through a floodplain that would be impassable by late autumn. The kind of error that could strand an entire battalion. Saris flagged it, documented the correction, and brought it to Master Aldrich, the head archivist, who went pale and carried it directly to the council chamber without a word. 2 hours later, a guard appeared at her desk. "The king requests your presence," he said. Saris stared at him. "I think you have the wrong person." The guard did not think he had the wrong person. The council chamber was enormous and terrifying, and full of men who looked at her the way one might look at a stray cat that had wandered into a formal dinner. Ceres stood at the far end of the table with the corrected map in her hands and tried to remember how speaking worked. King Soren Valdrin sat at the head of the table. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the palace had seen the king at a distance, but distance had not prepared her for proximity. He was broader than she'd expected, his presence filling the chair and the space around it in a way that made the room feel smaller. His dark hair was cut short, almost military, and his gray eyes watched her with an intensity that made her palms sweat. "Show me the error," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, and it shouldn't have made her stomach flip, but it did. Ceres spread the map on the table, with hands she willed not to shake, and pointed to the river crossing. She explained the misplotted coordinates, the floodplain risk, the revised route that would keep the supply line viable through the winter months. Soren listened without interrupting. His eyes moved between the map and her face, and she couldn't tell which one he was studying more carefully. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough to make her want to crawl under the table. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ceres, Your Majesty. I'm the junior cartographer." "Not anymore," he said. "You've just saved 1,000 soldiers from drowning in a floodplain. I'll have you reassigned to the senior division by the end of the week." And that was how it started. Over the following months, Saris found herself summoned to the council chamber with increasing frequency. Border disputes required accurate mapping, trade negotiations needed verified route distances. Military campaigns depended on terrain analysis that Saris could provide faster and more accurately than anyone else in the archive. Each time, she stood at the table and presented her work, and each time, the king watched her with those quiet gray eyes and asked questions that proved he'd actually been listening. It unnerved her. Important men did not listen to foundlings, but Soren did. The first time they spoke alone was an accident. She'd stayed late in the archive to finish a coastal survey, and he'd come looking for a historical map of the northern passes. She hadn't heard the door open. When she looked up from her desk and found the King of Valdren standing in the lamplight, she knocked an entire pot of ink across the survey she'd spent 4 hours rendering. "Oh no," she whispered, watching the black tide consume the coastline. Soren stared at the spreading ink. "That seems unfortunate." "Unfortunate," Saris repeated, her voice climbing. "That was 4 hours of work. Your Majesty, 4 hours. The elevation markers alone took me 40 minutes. And now they're drowning in ink, and I'm going to have to start the entire thing over from the original survey data, which is stored in the lower vault, which is locked after sundown. Which means I can't even begin again until tomorrow, which means the whole project is now a full day behind schedule." She ran out of breath and realized, with dawning horror, that she had just complained at the king. At length, with feeling, Soren looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something warm and startled, like he'd just been handed something unexpected. "Would it help if I had the vault unlocked?" he asked. Saris blinked. "You can do that." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I am the king, right?" Sarah said. Yes, that would help. He had the vault unlocked. He also stayed while she retrieved the survey data, sitting at the adjacent desk with his historical map, and they worked in companionable silence until well past midnight. It happened again the next week, and the week after that. The late nights became a pattern, neither of them acknowledged. He would appear in the archive after the palace had settled, sometimes with a document he needed, sometimes with nothing at all. Saris never asked why the King of Valdren had nothing better to do than sit in a dusty archive with a cartographer. She was afraid that if she asked, he'd realize how strange it was, and stop coming. They talked. Carefully at first, then less carefully. He told her about the pressures of the council, the endless negotiations, the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. She told him about the foundling house, about learning to draw maps from a retired surveyor who paid her in charcoal pencils and bread. "You never knew your parents?" he asked one night, his voice quieter than usual. "No," Sarah said, not looking up from her work. "I was left at the door when I was a few days old. No note, no name. The matron called me Saris because she said I looked like a girl she'd known once." The silence that followed had a texture to it, heavy but not pitying. She glanced up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You deserved better than that," he said. Nobody had ever said that to her before. Not once. Saris blinked rapidly and looked back down at her map because if she held his gaze for one more second, something inside her was going to crack open, and she would not be able to close it again. The first time he kissed her, it was raining. They were in the archive. She was reaching for a scroll on the upper shelf, and he was beside her, and somehow when she turned, his face was right there. Close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, close enough to feel his breath against her mouth. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, and kissed her anyway. The weeks that followed were the most reckless and radiant of her life. Secret meetings in the archive after dark, his hand finding hers beneath the council table when no one was watching. The stolen hour in the garden, when he'd pulled her behind the old oak and kissed her until she couldn't remember her own name. They never spoke about what they were. There was no language for it. He was the king. She was nobody. The distance between those two truths was an ocean. Neither of them could cross, so they simply pretended the ocean wasn't there, and met each other in the narrow space between. It couldn't last. She knew that. She'd always known. What she hadn't known was that it would end with two thin lines on a healer's test strip and a hand pressed to her stomach in a cold washroom at dawn, her whole body trembling with the enormity of what was growing inside her. Ceres told no one. For 3 days, she moved through the palace like a woman walking in her sleep. She filed maps, she attended briefings. She smiled when spoken to and nodded at the right moments and felt nothing at all because the alternative was feeling everything. And she couldn't afford that. Not yet. Not until she decided what to do. On the third night, she went to the archive as always. Soren was already there, sitting at the desk he'd claimed as his own, reading through a stack of trade agreements with the focused intensity that she'd once found intimidating and now found unbearably endearing. He looked up when she entered, smiled, the rare one, the one that softened the hard angles of his face and made her whole body ache with wanting. "You're late," he said. "You're in my chair," she replied, because banter was safe and truth was not. She sat across from him and pretended to work. The words on the page swam. Her hand drifted to her stomach beneath the desk, and she pulled it back like she'd been burned. "Tell him," the voice in her head demanded. "Tell him, right now." But every time she opened her mouth, the words dissolved. Because telling him meant making it real. Making it real meant facing what came next. And what came next terrified her more than anything she had ever faced in her life. The next morning, the council held an open session. Ceres was there to present updated boundary maps for the Eastern Territories. She stood at the side of the chamber and waited her turn. And that was when she heard it. Councillor Harwick, a thin man with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, was addressing the king in the careful, measured tone that meant politics. "Your Majesty, the delegation from the Ashenmere Pack arrives in 3 weeks. Lady Vesper's father has been most generous in his correspondence. The alliance would secure our eastern border permanently, and a formal mating between the two bloodlines would cement the arrangement beyond any diplomatic uncertainty." The chamber murmured its approval. Ceres stood perfectly still. "The lady is of excellent breeding," Harwick continued. "Alpha-born, well-educated, and by all accounts entirely suitable. Her father controls the Ashenmere Pass, which, as this council is well aware, is the only viable supply corridor to our eastern garrisons." Soren's expression was unreadable. "Then, you'll agree that the advantages are considerable," Harwick pressed. "A mating alliance of this nature would be the most strategically significant union in a generation." The king said nothing. Ceres felt the room close in around her. A mating alliance. A suitable woman of excellent breeding. Alpha-born. Everything. Ceres was not and would never be. She delivered her map presentation. She didn't remember a single word of it afterward. That evening, she went to see Orlaith. The old healer lived in a cramped room at the back of the infirmary, surrounded by jars of dried roots and bundles of herbs that made the air thick and sweet. Orlaith had been the palace midwife for longer than most people could remember, and she was the closest thing to a mother Ceres had ever known. "I need to ask you something," Ceres said, standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. "And I need you to answer honestly." Orlaith looked up from the tincture she was measuring. Her eyes were sharp and clear despite her age, and they narrowed slightly as they took in Ceres's face. "Sit down," Orlaith said. Ceres sat. "If a woman of no rank and no bloodline were carrying a child, and if that child's father were someone of great importance, someone whose position demanded a strategic mating alliance with a woman of proper standing," she swallowed, "what would happen to that child?" Orlaith set down the tincture very carefully. "That depends," she said slowly, "on who the father is, Orlaith." The old woman studied her for a long moment. "If the father were powerful enough, the child would be seen as a complication. A rival claim to any legitimate heir born of the proper union, in the best case. The child would be taken and raised quietly elsewhere, far from court, in the worst case. She trailed off. Powerful men have powerful enemies, child. And enemies look for leverage. The blood drained from Saria's face. The mother, she whispered. Orlay's expression softened with something close to grief. Discarded, silenced, removed from proximity so the proper mating could proceed without inconvenience. The court has a long memory for scandal and no tolerance for complications. Saris pressed her hand to her mouth. The room swam. Child, Orlay said carefully, leaning forward. Are you asking me this for a reason? No, Saris said. I was just curious. Orlay didn't believe her. Saris could see it in her eyes. But the old woman didn't push, and Saris fled the infirmary before the tears could fall. She made the decision that night. She would not tell him. She would not give the court the chance to take her child. She would not wait to be discarded, to watch her baby pulled from her arms and handed to strangers, to become the inconvenient mistake that the palace swept under the rug. She had been left at a door once. Abandoned without a name or a reason. She would die before she let that happen to her child. Sarah's packed the leather satchel in the dark. 2 changes of clothes. The small purse of savings she'd accumulated over years of careful living. A map of the Western territories that she'd drawn herself, marking every village too small and too remote to attract attention. She didn't go to the archive that night. She didn't leave a note. She stood at the servants' gate at the eastern wall, one hand on the cold iron latch, and the other pressed flat against her stomach, and she looked back at the palace one last time. The king's tower was lit. A single candle burned in the window of the room where she knew he sat reading alone. Her wolf howled inside her chest, clawing, desperate, screaming at her to turn around, to go back, to stay. Saris opened the gate and walked into the dark. She traveled for 11 days, on foot through the western valleys, following shepherd trails and river paths that didn't appear on any official maps. She slept in barns and under hedgerows, and once in the hollow of a dead oak tree. When the rain was too heavy to keep walking, she ate what she could forage, and spent her coin only when she had to. On the 12th day, she reached Thornfeld. It was perfect. A dozen cottages along a river crossing, surrounded by forest on 3 sides and accessible only by a single unpaved road that turned to mud in the rain and dust in the summer. The nearest town of any size was a full day's ride. There was no garrison, no tax collector, no reason for anyone important to ever come here. Saris told the village elder she was a widow, a healer's apprentice from the east, looking for a quiet place to settle. The elder, a heavy-set woman named Marin, who asked few questions and expected hard work in return for shelter, gave her the empty cottage at the edge of the village and told her the roof leaked. I can fix a roof, Saris said. Then you'll do fine here, Marin replied. And she did. She fixed the roof. She planted herbs. She delivered babies and set broken bones and treated fevers with the skills Orlaith had taught her. And slowly, carefully, the village accepted her as one of their own. Emmerich was born on a freezing night in the dead of winter, with only Marin's steady hands and a fire that kept threatening to go out. He came into the world screaming, furious, with a full head of dark hair and the gray eyes of the Valdrin bloodline. Saris held him against her chest and wept, for joy, for grief, for the man who would never know his son's name. The years passed. Emmerich grew. He was fierce and curious and stubborn in ways that made her heart twist because she could see Sorin in every defiant tilt of his chin. She told him stories about a brave king from a far-off land, and Emmerich listened with his father's intensity and asked questions she couldn't answer without her voice breaking. It was enough. It had to be enough. And then, on a cold morning 6 weeks before the rains, Emmerich and a neighbor's daughter were playing near the goat pen when a stray dog, half feral and starving, came snarling out of the tree line. The neighbor's girl screamed. Emmerich stepped in front of her. He was 2 years old. The growl that came out of him was not the sound a 2-year-old boy makes. It was deep and resonant, and layered with something primal that vibrated in the bones of every person within earshot. His eyes blazed gold. Not amber, not hazel, gold. Alpha gold, bright and unmistakable, burning in the face of a toddler who should not have been able to shift for another decade at least. The dog fled. The neighbor's daughter stopped crying. And Ceres, who had been running toward them from the herb garden, stopped dead in the middle of the path with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. 3 villagers had seen it. Then, the story spread to 5. Then 10. Within a week, every person in Thornfeld was whispering about the widow's boy with the golden eyes. Ceres told herself it would pass. Villagers gossiped and then forgot. No one in Thornfeld had any connection to the court. No one here would know what alpha gold eyes in a child that young truly meant. She was wrong. 4 weeks later, she came home from gathering yarrow by the river. Marin was standing outside her cottage, pale-faced and rigid. "Soldiers came through an hour ago," Marin said, her voice tight. "They were asking about a woman and a boy. A woman with dark hair who arrived about 3 years ago." She paused. "Royal soldiers, Ceres." The basket of yarrow slipped from Ceres's fingers and hit the ground. "Where is Emmerich?" she breathed. "Inside, sleeping." Ceres pushed past her into the cottage. Emmerich was curled on his cot, his curls spread across the pillow, his breathing slow and peaceful, and utterly unaware that the world his mother had built to protect him was crumbling around them both. She reached for the leather satchel beneath the bed. It wasn't there. She'd unpacked it. Sometime during the 2nd year, she'd finally unpacked it. She'd told herself it meant she was settling in, putting down roots, choosing to believe that the danger had passed. She'd been a fool. "Where did they go?" Ceres asked, straightening up. "The soldiers. Which direction?" "North," Marin said from the doorway. "But Ceres, they said they'd be back. They said they were sending word to the capital." "Sending word? To the capital, to him?" Ceres closed her eyes. She had maybe 2 days, maybe less. 2 days to take Emmerich and disappear again, to find another village, another name, another life, small enough to hide in. She opened her eyes and began to pack. But that night, she dreamed of gray eyes and candlelight, and the way his voice had sounded when he'd said her name in the quiet of the archive, and when she woke, her pillow was wet, and her chest ached with a hollowness that all the distance in the world had done nothing to fill. She was still packing when the hooves came up the northern road. She was still holding Emmerich when she opened the back door and found the Alpha King standing in her garden in the rain. And now, there was nowhere left to run. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain fell between them like a curtain, soaking through Ceres's dress, plastering Emmerich's curls flat against his forehead. The boys stared at the tall stranger with open curiosity, completely unaware that the ground beneath their lives had just split open. Soren's gaze was locked on the child. His face had gone white, the way a man's face goes white when the wound is so deep the pain hasn't arrived yet. His eyes moved over Emmerich's features with a desperate, searching hunger. The curls, the stubborn set of the jaw. The gray eyes that were his own, staring back at him from a face he had never seen before. "How old is he?" Soren's voice was barely a whisper. Ceres held Emmerich tighter. "Soren, let me explain. How old?" The whisper became something harder. Something fractured. "He'll be 3 in the winter." She watched him do the math, watched the precise moment it landed. His breath left him like he'd been struck in the chest, and his hand came up to grip the fence post beside him, as though the ground had become unreliable. She'd been pregnant when she left. She'd known, and she'd walked away without a word, carrying his child into the dark. "What's his name?" Soren asked. The control in his voice was terrible, the kind of control that exists only because the alternative is destruction. "Emmerich." Something moved across his face. Pain, raw and unguarded and so profound. It made Ceres's eyes sting. "Mama," Emmerich said, tugging at her collar. "Mama, the man is sad." The sound that came out of Soren was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob. He pressed his hand over his mouth and turned away, his shoulders rigid, his whole body vibrating with the effort of holding himself together. Saris took a step back toward the door. Instinct. Protect the child. Create distance. Find a way out. The same instinct that had driven her from the palace all those years ago. Soren caught the movement. He turned back, and the grief in his face had been replaced by something colder, something sharp and wounded and very, very angry. Don't, he said one word, low and dangerous, and it froze her where she stood. I wasn't going to run, she lied. You've done nothing but run. His voice was quiet, but the fury in it pressed against her skin like heat from a fire. I searched for you, Saris. I sent riders to every province, every village, every outpost in the kingdom. I thought you were dead. Do you understand what that means? I grieved for you. I buried you in my mind because it was the only way I could survive losing you, and you were here. His voice cracked on the last word. Alive, with my son. A son I didn't know existed. I was protecting him, Saris shot back, her voice rising. I was protecting him from the court, from the politics, from being treated as a complication to be dealt with. By who? Soren demanded. Who threatened you? Who told you that your child would be in danger? Give me a name, Saris. Nobody threatened me. I heard what the council was planning. The mating alliance with Ashenmere. Lady Vesper. A proper match. A woman of suitable breeding. The old bitterness rose in her throat like bile. I heard Councillor Harwick lay it out like a business arrangement, and I understood exactly where I stood, where our child would stand, an inconvenience. A scandal to be managed. Soren stared at her. You left because of Harwick's proposal? I left because the proposal was going to be accepted, and, when it was, my child would have become a threat to every legitimate heir that followed. I know how courts work, Soren. I know what happens to illegitimate children who carry royal blood. Her voice shook but didn't break. I grew up without parents. I was not going to let my son grow up without a mother. The silence between them was savage. The rain intensified, drumming against the cottage roof, running in streams off the fence posts. Soren's hands were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. A muscle in his jaw jumped and jumped again, and Saris could see him fighting something inside himself, fighting the urge to shout or break or reach for her. I refused the alliance, he said. Sirius's breath stopped. I refused it. That same week, before the delegation even arrived, his jaw was tight, the words coming out like they cost him something. I refused it because I was in love with a cartographer who had vanished from my palace without a single word of explanation, and I couldn't bring myself to bind my life to someone else while I was still searching for her. The words hit Saris like a physical blow. Her legs went weak. She tightened her arms around Emmerich, who had gone quiet in the way children go quiet when they sense something enormous happening around them. You didn't know that, Soren continued, his voice rougher now. Because you didn't ask. You didn't trust me enough to ask. I didn't think I had the right to ask, Saris whispered. I was nobody. A foundling with no name, no family, no claim on you. You had every claim on me. The words tore out of him, raw and wrecked. Every single one. And you left. Anyway. The accusation hung between them, heavy as stone. Saris wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that the fear had been so consuming it had left no room for trust. But, looking at his face, at the devastation written across it, she realized that her fear had done exactly what it had always done. It had told her a story about the future, and she had believed it without question, and the story had been wrong. Emmerich whimpered. The tension in the air had grown thick enough to taste, and the boy's small body had gone rigid in Saris's arms. His hands gripped her collar, his face pressed against her neck. Mama, he whispered. Mama, I don't like the loud. They weren't being loud. Neither of them had raised their voice above a strained murmur. But the boy wasn't reacting to sound. He was reacting to something else entirely. Something that vibrated beneath the surface of the conversation, the taut, fraying thread of the bond that had never been completed between his parents. Pulling and straining and humming with distress, Emmerich's eyes opened. They were gold. Not the gray of a moment ago. Right. Burning. Unmistakable gold that blazed in his small face like twin flames. The air around them shifted. Saris felt it. A pressure drop, a tightening, as though the atmosphere itself had clenched. The rain falling closest to the boy seemed to slow, hanging suspended for a fraction of a second before resuming its fall. The herbs along the fence shuddered, even though the wind had died. A low vibration moved through the ground beneath their feet, subtle but unmistakable, as if something deep underground had turned over in its sleep. Soren went perfectly still, his anger evaporated, replaced by something far more primal. His nostrils flared, his pupils dilated. Every line of his body shifted from fury to pure predatory alertness. He took a half step forward, stopped himself, and his gaze snapped between the boy and Saris, with a wild, searching intensity. "What is that?" he breathed. Saris pressed her cheek against Emmerich's hair, murmuring soft, soothing sounds, rocking him gently even though her own heart was slamming against her ribs. The gold in the boy's eyes flickered, dimmed, and faded back to gray. His small body relaxed against her, the strange pressure in the air dissolved. The rain resumed its normal rhythm. "It started 6 weeks ago," Ceres said quietly, not looking up. His eyes change. Things happen around him when he's frightened or upset. The air gets heavy. Objects shake. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to stop it. Soren's gaze stayed on the boy for a long, terrible moment. The anger was gone. The accusation was gone. What remained on his face was something she had never seen there before, not even in the darkest hours of their time together. Fear. Not for himself. For the boy. For his son. "You're coming back to the palace," he said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command either. Not really. It was the voice of a man who had just discovered that something precious was in danger and who would dismantle the world to protect it. Ceres looked at him through the rain, at the father her son had never known, at the man she had loved and left and never stopped dreaming about. "I know," she said. The journey to the capital took 4 days. Soren had brought 6 soldiers and 2 horses. He gave Ceres the bay mare without discussion, and she rode with Emmerich settled in front of her, the boy's small hands gripping the saddle horn with fierce determination. Soren rode ahead on the black stallion, his back straight, his eyes forward, and he did not look at her. He looked at Emmerich constantly. Ceres caught it in small, stolen glances. The way Soren's gaze would drift to the boy when he thought no one was watching. The way his expression would shift from something guarded to something aching and unfinished before he'd catch himself and look away. He was studying his son the way a starving man studies a meal. He isn't sure he's allowed to eat. Emmerich, for his part, was having the best week of his life. He'd never seen soldiers before, he'd never ridden a horse. He'd never traveled beyond the forest edge of Thornfeld. And now, the entire world was opening up around him like a storybook, and his small voice never stopped asking questions. "Mama, why does that horse have spots? Mama, what's that bird called? Mama, is that a castle? Mama, why does that man have a sword? Can I have a sword?" "No," Ceres said. "Not yet," Soren said. At exactly the same time. They both froze. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to the boy, and the words had come out of him so naturally, so instinctively, that he looked almost startled by them. Emmerich twisted around in the saddle to look at him. "When can I have one?" Soren opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ceres with an expression that clearly said he had no idea how to answer a question from a child, and was in completely uncharted territory. "When you're older," Ceres supplied. "How much older?" "Much older. Like 5, like 15. "That's forever," Emmerich said, with the devastating certainty of a child who has just been told the worst news of his entire life. One of the soldiers coughed. It sounded suspiciously like a laugh. They camped that first night in a clearing beside a stream. The soldiers set up tents with quiet efficiency, and Ceres settled Emmerich into the smallest one with every blanket she could gather. The boy fell asleep within minutes, exhausted by the day's excitement. His small fist curled around the carved wooden horse that Marin had pressed into his hands as they'd left Thornfeld. Sarah sat beside him and watched him breathe, and tried not to think about what was waiting for them at the end of this road. He's fearless. She looked up. Soren stood at the entrance of the tent, silhouetted against the firelight. His voice was low enough not to wake the boy. "He gets that from you," Sarah said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face. He looked at the sleeping child, and the raw longing in his expression was almost too private to witness. Every milestone he'd missed, first steps, first words, first nightmares. The carved wooden horse should have been from him. "What was his first word?" Soren asked. "Map," Sarah said. "I used to draw them while he napped." He grabbed a pencil one day and said, "Map," and then drew a line across my survey of the northern ridge. The ghost of a smile crossed Soren's mouth. "A cartographer's son, and a king's," Ceres said quietly. The smile vanished. He stood there for another moment, looking at the boy with an expression that held so much grief it was almost indistinguishable from love. Then he turned and walked back toward the fire without another word. On the second night, Emmerich refused to sleep without a story. Sarah's told him the one about the brave king and the mountain of stars. The same story she'd been telling him for a year, and she was halfway through it when she realized Soren was standing in the dark just outside the tent, listening. She didn't stop. She finished the story, her voice steady, even as her heart raced, and when she looked up, he was gone. On the third morning, Emmerich woke before either of them. Sarah's found him sitting cross-legged outside Soren's tent, talking to the guard posted there with the easy confidence of a boy who had never once doubted that the world wanted to hear what he had to say. "My mama makes medicine," Emmerich was telling the guard. "She can fix anything. She fixed Mr. Torvald's leg when it went all purple and bendy." The guard, a broad man with a scar across his chin who looked like he'd seen more battles than birthdays, nodded solemnly. "Purple and bendy. That sounds serious." "It was very serious," Emmerich confirmed. He screamed. Soren emerged from his tent and stopped. The guard snapped to attention. Emmerich looked up at the king and beamed. "Good morning," the boy said. "Can I have eggs?" Soren looked at his son, looked at the guard, looked at the sky as if consulting it for guidance. "We have dried provisions," he said carefully. "I don't think we have eggs." Emmerich's face fell with the exaggerated tragedy that only a small child could produce. Soren turned to the nearest soldier. "Find eggs," he said, with the same tone he might use to order a military advance. Ceres, watching from across the camp, bit her lip hard to keep from laughing. Later that day, Emmerich's horse fascination reached its peak. He leaned so far forward in the saddle trying to pat the mare's neck that Ceres nearly lost her grip on him, and in the scramble to pull him back, she dropped the reins. Soren was beside them in an instant. His hand closed around the bridle, steadying the mare, and his other hand reached out and caught Emmerich by the back of his coat, lifting the boy cleanly out of the saddle and settling him against his own chest with a movement so fluid and instinctive it looked like he'd been doing it for years. Emmerich looked up at him, startled. Soren looked down at Emmerich, equally startled. "Hello?" Emmerich said. "Hello," Soren replied. And then Emmerich, who had inherited his mother's talent for filling silence, and his father's stubbornness in equal measure, said, "You're the brave king from Mama's stories, aren't you?" Soren's face did something complicated. His gaze lifted to Saris. She looked away, heat flooding her cheeks. "Your mother tells you stories about a king?" Soren asked carefully. "Every night," Emmerich confirmed. "He fights on monsters, and he's very tall, and he's sad because he lost someone important." The silence that followed was so heavy, Ceres thought it might crush her. Soren looked at her across the boy's head, and in his eyes she saw the question he didn't ask, the one that mattered more than anger, more than betrayal, more than all the silence between them. "Did you miss me?" She couldn't answer. Not out loud. Not yet. That night, Emmerich fell asleep in Soren's tent. It happened without planning. The boy had wandered in while Soren was reviewing correspondence, climbed onto the camp cot with the confidence of a child who has never been told no, and passed out with his head on the king's pillow. Soren didn't move him. He sat in the canvas chair beside the cot and watched his son sleep for 3 hours. When Saris came looking for Emmerich, she found them like that. Ligber. The king, motionless, watchful, guarding the boy's rest with a ferocity that he probably didn't even realize was written across his face. "You should sleep," Saris whispered from the tent entrance. "I've missed enough," Soren said, not taking his eyes off the boy. "I'll sleep later." Saris's throat tightened. She turned and went back to her own tent and lay awake until dawn. They reached the palace on the 4th afternoon. The walls rose above them, pale stone against gray sky, and Saris felt the dread settle into her bones like cold water. The last time she'd walked through these gates, she'd been running away. Now she was walking back in, and everything was different, and nothing had changed. Orlaith was waiting in the entrance hall. The old healer took one look at Sarah's, one look at the boy on her hip, and her eyes filled with tears. "You foolish, brave girl," she whispered, pulling Ceres into an embrace that smelled of dried lavender and home. "You absolute fool." "I know," Ceres said, her voice breaking. Orlaith pulled back, cupped Ceres's face in her weathered hands, then turned her attention to Emmerich. The boy regarded her with solemn curiosity. Orlaith studied him the way healers do, reading things in his face that others couldn't see. Whatever she found there made her expression shift. The warmth drained away, replaced by something careful and clinical and quietly alarmed. "Ceres," Orlaith said slowly, "we need to talk about this child." Ceres asked, her arms tightening around Emmerich. Orlaith glanced at Soren, who stood a few paces behind, watching with an intensity that could have melted stone. "Not here," the healer said. "Bring him to the infirmary, both of you. Tonight, after he's settled." "Orlaith, what is it? What's wrong with him?" The old woman didn't answer. She just looked at the boy with an expression that Ceres had seen only once before, on the face of a healer who just discovered something she desperately wished she hadn't. Emmerich fell asleep in the chambers they'd been given, a set of rooms in the western wing that were nicer than anything Ceres had ever lived in, and clearly chosen by someone who wanted to make a point about status without committing to one. Not the royal wing, not the servants' quarters, somewhere in between, a holding pattern. She watched him sleep for a long time. His curls spread across the pillow, his breathing slow and even, his small face peaceful. The carved wooden horse from Marin sat on the bedside table, standing guard. Then she went to the infirmary. Soren was already there. He stood against the far wall, with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Fenric, his beta, stood beside him. Ceres hadn't seen the man since she'd left, and he looked exactly the same, calm, measured, slightly amused by the chaos around him, in the way that only truly competent people could afford to be. Orlaith sat at her workbench, her hands folded in her lap, which was wrong. Orlaith's hands were never still. She was always grinding, measuring, mixing. The stillness of her hands told Ceres that whatever was coming was bad. "Sit down," Orlaith said. "I'd rather stand," Ceres replied. "Sit down, child." Ceres sat. Orlaith looked at her for a moment, then at Soren, then back at Ceres. "I told him I was checking for travel sickness. He was very cooperative and asked me 14 questions about the jars on my shelves." Despite everything, Ceres felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "His vitals are strong. His growth is normal. He's healthy, right, and by all visible measures, thriving." Orlaith paused. "But what's happening beneath the surface is not normal. And it's not safe." Ceres's stomach dropped. "The eyes, the gold. That's a symptom, not the problem," Orlaith said. The problem is his wolf. She stood and moved to the workbench, pulling a sheet of parchment toward her and sketching as she spoke. In a normal shifter child, the wolf develops gradually. It's tethered to the parents' bond. Both parents, particularly an alpha and his mate, create what we call a resonance, a stabilizing frequency that the child's wolf mirrors and draws from as it grows. Think of it as scaffolding. The parents' bond holds the structure in place while the child's wolf builds itself inside it. Ceres felt the blood draining from her face. And if there's no bond, then there's no scaffolding, Orlais said flatly. The wolf develops without an anchor. It grows too fast, too strong, with nothing to ground it. In most cases, this causes minor instability, mood swings, difficulty shifting later in life, manageable things. But Emmerich isn't most cases, Soren said from the wall. His voice was quiet, controlled, but Ceres could hear the tension coiled beneath it like a spring. No, Orlaith agreed. Emmerich is the son of the strongest alpha in 3 generations. The power he's inherited is extraordinary, and without the stabilizing resonance of a completed parental bond, that power has no anchor. It's growing unchecked. Ceres gripped the edge of her chair. The episodes, the golden eyes, the air pressure changing around him. They'll get worse, Orlaith said. The surges are his wolf trying to assert itself without a foundation. Each one will be stronger than the last. At this rate, within a few months, the surges could become violent, uncontrollable, the kind that would be dangerous to everyone around him, and most of all, to Emmerich himself. Could they kill him? Ceres's voice came out as a whisper. Orlaith didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. Ceres pressed her hand over her mouth. The room swam, and she felt her body start to shake. A fine, full-body tremor that she couldn't control. She'd left to protect him. She'd given up everything, abandoned the man she loved, built a life from nothing in a village at the edge of nowhere, all to keep her son safe. And in doing so, she'd created the very thing that was putting him in danger. "This is my fault." The words came out broken. "No," Soren said sharply. She looked at him. His arms had dropped from their crossed position. His hands were at his sides, clenched into fists, and his face was stripped of every defense. He looked gutted. "This is not your fault," he repeated, and his voice had a rawness to it that she hadn't heard since the garden in Thornfeld. "You didn't know. You couldn't have known. But I left. If I'd stayed, if I'd told you, the bond would have, and if I'd made you feel safe enough to stay, you wouldn't have left." The words came out of him like a confession, low and rough and costly. "I knew you were afraid. I knew the court made you feel like you didn't belong. I saw it every time you flinched when someone called you the foundling. And I told myself you were strong enough to endure it. That what we had was enough. I should have fought harder. I should have told you what you meant to me before you had a reason to doubt it." Ceres stared at him. In all the time she'd spent replaying their story, she'd cast him in a dozen roles. The king who would have discarded her. The man who was better off without her. The powerful figure whose world had no room for someone like her. She'd never once imagined this version. The man who blamed himself for not giving her a reason to stay. "Well," Orlaith said, after a silence that stretched long enough to develop its own weather. "Now that you've both finished taking credit for the same mistake, perhaps we can discuss the solution." Fenric coughed quietly. "The bond," Ceres said, wiping her eyes. "You said the child needs the parent's bond as an anchor. So if Soren and I complete the bond," "Yes," Orlaith finished, "the resonance between a mated pair would stabilize Emmerich's wolf. It's the natural mechanism. It's what his body is looking for and not finding." The implication settled over the room like fog. "You're saying we need to mate," Soren said. His voice was carefully neutral. "I'm saying your son needs you to," Orlaith corrected. "There's a difference. We can't just bond because we need to," Ceres said, her cheeks burning. "That's not how it works. A mating bond isn't a medical prescription." "No, it isn't," Orlaith agreed. But you two are already halfway there, and you have been since long before you left this palace. She looked between them with the patient exasperation of a woman who had spent too many years watching intelligent people avoid obvious truths. The pull you feel toward each other, the ache of separation. The way your worlds respond to each other's presence, that's an incomplete bond. It's been trying to form for over 3 years, and you've both been fighting it. Saris's pulse hammered. She didn't dare look at Soren. For now, Orlaith continued, proximity helps. Physical closeness between both parents and the child gives Imric's wolf something to mirror. Even without a completed bond, it won't fix the problem, but it will slow the surges, buy us time. How much time? Soren asked. Months, maybe, if you're lucky. The surges will still come, but they'll come less frequently and with less force if the boy is near. Both of you. Regularly. Daily. So, we need to spend time together, Ceres said carefully. The 3 of us. Every day, Orlaith confirmed. As much as possible. And I'd recommend proximity at night as well. The boy should sleep near both parents. The resonance is strongest during sleep when the wolf is most active. Ceres's mind raced. Adjacent chambers, shared meals, daily contact with the man she'd loved and left and was terrified of loving again. All of it necessary, all of it unavoidable, all of it for the sake of the boy sleeping upstairs with a wooden horse clutched in his fist. I'll have the chambers reconfigured, Fenric said quietly, as though redesigning the living arrangements of the Alpha King was simply the next item on a very orderly to-do list. Soren looked at Ceres. She looked at him. All that distance, and now they would be closer than ever, bound together not by choice, but by the desperate need to save their son. The air between them hummed with everything unspoken. The pull of the incomplete bond was almost physical, a tightness in her ribs, a warmth in her blood that intensified whenever he was near. We'll make it work, Ceres said. Soren held her gaze. Yes, he said, we will. But even as she said the words, a cold thread of fear wound through her, because proximity, without resolution, was a knife's edge. And the closer they got, the harder it would be to pretend that what she felt for him was merely cooperation. Merely parenting, merely survival. It was more, it had always been more. And the terrifying part wasn't admitting it. The terrifying part was that Orlaith had said months. And looking at the haunted exhaustion in Soren's face, looking at the way his hands still trembled when he spoke about the boy, Ceres wasn't sure either of them had months. She wasn't sure Emmerich did either. That night, she moved the boy's cot into the room adjoining Soren's chambers. She left the connecting door open. And she lay awake in the dark, listening to her son breathe on one side and the Alpha King's restless pacing on the other, and wondered how long 2 people could orbit each other before the gravity between them became impossible to resist. Somewhere past midnight, the pacing stopped. Somewhere past midnight, in the silence that followed, Emmerich whimpered in his sleep and his small hands glowed faintly gold in the dark. Ceres reached for him. But another hand was already there. Soren knelt beside the cot, his palm resting gently on the boy's chest, his face inches from his son's. The glow dimmed, Emmerich's breathing steadied, the room settled. Soren didn't move. He stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor in the dark, one hand on his son's heart, and when Ceres looked at his face, she saw that his eyes were wet. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Felt the jolt that ran through him at the contact, felt the answering surge in her own body, warm and aching and undeniable. Neither of them spoke, neither of them pulled away. They stayed like that, both hands on the boy, the incomplete bond trembling between them like a held breath, until Emmerich's dreams carried him somewhere safe, and the gold faded from his skin entirely. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Ceres hadn't expected, something almost gentle, almost normal, almost unbearable in how much she wanted it to be real. Mornings belonged to Emmerich. The boy woke with the sun, exploding out of sleep like a small curly-haired cannonball, and he'd barrel into whatever room offered the most interesting possibilities. Usually, this was Soren's study. The king had taken to leaving the connecting door open. He never said why. Ceres never asked. But every morning, Emmerich would pad through on bare feet, climb onto the chair across from his father's desk, and announce what he wanted for breakfast with the gravity of a man issuing a royal decree. "Eggs," Emmerich would say, his chin barely clearing the desk. "And the bread with the seeds. And the jam, but not the orange one. The red one." Soren would look at his son over the top of whatever correspondence he was pretending to read and nod with an expression of absolute seriousness. "The red jam noted." Ceres watched these exchanges from the doorway, her whole body aching, with a sweetness that bordered on pain. She saw Soren learning to be a father the way a man teaches himself to breathe at high altitude, carefully, deliberately, with the constant fear that he was doing it wrong. He held Emmerich like the boy was made of glass. He answered every question with the same focused intensity he brought to affairs of state. When Emmerich asked why the sky was blue, Soren gave him a 15-minute explanation involving atmospheric refraction that the boy absolutely did not understand, but listened to with rapt attention because his father was speaking, and that was enough. "You're overcomplicating it," their Ceres told him one afternoon, after Emmerich had asked where rain came from and Soren had begun explaining the water cycle. With the help of a diagram sketched on council stationery, he asked a question. "I'm answering it. He's 2, nearly 3. And he's clever, he gets that from you." The compliment landed before either of them was ready for it. Soren cleared his throat and looked away. Ceres busied herself with folding a blanket that didn't need folding. The evenings were harder. After Emmerich fell asleep, the buffer between them disappeared. The boy's presence was a bridge. Without it, they were just 2 people alone, in adjacent rooms, with a connecting door that neither of them closed and neither of them walked through. Ceres could feel the pull constantly, now. The incomplete bond had sharpened with proximity, becoming something she couldn't ignore or explain away. She felt his presence like a current in the air, felt his moods shift through the wall between them, the restlessness, the grief, the quiet longing that matched her own. Some nights she stood at the connecting door, with her hand on the frame, close enough to hear him breathing, and talked herself out of crossing the threshold. The surges continued, but they were milder now. Or Leif had been right. The proximity of both parents dampened the instability in Emmerich's wolf. The golden flashes in his eyes came less frequently, and when they did, a touch from either parent was enough to soothe them. The strange pressure in the air that accompanied each episode had softened to something barely perceptible. For 3 weeks, Ceres let herself believe it might be enough. The court had other ideas. Councillor Harwick requested a private audience with the king on a cold Tuesday morning. Ceres wasn't present, but she heard about it within the hour from Fenric, who relayed the conversation with the clinical precision of a man delivering battlefield intelligence. Harwick had laid out his concerns with the methodical cruelty of a surgeon. The foundling's return with an unrecognized child was destabilizing the court. 3 noble families had sent formal inquiries about the succession. The Ashenmere pack, still raw from the rejected alliance, was using a scandal to undermine Vaudren's diplomatic standing in the Eastern Territories. And worst of all, whispers had reached Harwick that the boy was volatile, that his eyes turned gold, that strange things happened in his proximity. The councillor suggested that the child represents a threat to the throne, Fenric said evenly, not as an heir, but as a danger. An unstable wolf with royal blood and no formal standing is a liability that the court cannot afford. "What did Soren say?" Ceres asked, her voice tight. The king dismissed the councillor. "Good," Fenric paused. He dismissed him from the room, not from his thoughts. The king has been in his study for 2 hours. He hasn't spoken to anyone. Ceres found Soren in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door. His reflection in the glass was gaunt. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened again, and his shoulders carried a tension she hadn't seen since Thornfeld. "Don't," she said from the doorway. He didn't turn. Don't what? Whatever you're thinking, don't. I'm thinking that Harwick is right. Cerise crossed the room. Harwick is a politician who measures people in terms of usefulness and sees a 2-year-old child as a chess piece. Harwick is a politician who has kept this kingdom stable for 20 years, Soren said, finally turning. His face was drawn, and he's right, that Emmerich isn't safe here. Not like this. Not while the court sees him as a complication, and not while his wolf is still unstable. The surges are getting better, Orlaith said. Proximity is working. Proximity is buying time. It isn't a solution. Then we find a solution. Here, you don't get to send us away again, Soren. You don't get to decide what's best for us by pushing us out of your life. His jaw tightened. This isn't about what I want. Then what is it about? It's about the fact that 3 noble houses are calling for your removal. Harwick is building a formal case to have Emmerich declared a ward of the court rather than a royal heir. And if they succeed, I won't be able to protect either of you. Not legally, not politically, not in any way that matters. His voice cracked. I am trying to keep you safe by sending us back to Thornfeld, by putting an entire kingdom's distance between Emmerich and the only thing keeping his wolf from tearing him apart. A few weeks, Soren said, his voice low and strained. Just until I've dealt with Harwick. Until the court settles. I'll send guards. Orlaith can travel with you, and the moment it's safe, I'll bring you back. A few weeks could kill him, Sarah shouted, and the force of it startled them both. Orlaith said months if we're lucky. She didn't say months of visits and letters, she said daily proximity, both parents. Together. Soren flinched like she'd struck him. If Harwick succeeds in having Emmerich declared a ward, they'll take him from both of us. Do you understand? Not Thornfeld, not hiding. Taken. Placed under the court's guardianship. I will have no authority over my own son. Is that what you want? The fight drained out of her. She saw it then. The trap he was caught in. Politics on one side, his son's survival on the other, and no path that didn't require sacrificing something essential. I won't go, Ceres whispered. You have to. I won't survive it. Neither will Emmerich. Ceres, please. The word broke in his mouth. He reached for her, then stopped himself, his hand hovering in the space between them. Please, just trust me. I trusted myself once before, and I was wrong, she said, her eyes burning. Don't ask me to make the same mistake twice. But Soren was the king, and sometimes kings made decisions that broke them. The next morning, a carriage waited in the courtyard. Orlaith stood beside it, grim-faced and furious, clutching a medical bag. Ceres carried Emmerich down the steps, her face carved from stone. Soren stood at the top of the staircase and watched them go, and the look on his face was the most devastating thing she had ever seen. Not anger, not resolve, just raw, annihilating loss. Emmerich waved at his father through the carriage window. Bye-bye, Papa. Soren's composure shattered. He turned away before the carriage rounded the corner, and Fenric later told Ceres that the king had locked himself in his study and not come out for 2 days. They made it 5 days. On the first night, Emmerich's eyes flickered gold 3 times before morning. On the second night, the pressure surges returned, strong enough to rattle the windows of the inn where they'd stopped. On the third night, Emmerich woke, screaming, his small body rigid, his eyes blazing so bright they lit the room. On the 4th day, he stopped eating. On the 5th day, he stopped speaking. Orlaith examined him with hands that shook and looked at Ceres with an expression that said, everything words could not. We're going back, Ceres said. The king gave orders that you stay away from the capital until he sends word. Then the king can arrest me when I get there. Ceres bundled Emmerich into a blanket, climbed onto the nearest horse, and rode through the night. She reached the palace at dawn. The guards at the gate took one look at the boy in her arms, limp and burning with fever, his skin faintly luminous with the gold that now pulsed beneath it like a second heartbeat, and they let her through without a word. Saris ran. Through the entrance hall, up the stairs, down the corridor, to Soren's chambers. The route burned into her memory from 3 weeks of proximity that she'd give anything to have back. She hit the door with her shoulder, because her arms were full of Emmerich and she couldn't reach the handle. The door flew open. Soren stood on the other side. He was dressed, but barely. His shirt was untucked, his hair disordered, his face hollowed out by 5 days of guilt and sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had been destroying himself, methodically and with great efficiency. "Something's wrong with him," Ceres gasped, pushing past Soren into the room. "He stopped talking yesterday. He won't eat, his eyes haven't gone back to gray in 2 days, and the glow is getting worse. Orlaith says his wolf is destabilizing. She says we're out of time." Soren was already moving. He took Emmerich from her arms with a gentleness that contradicted the speed of his movements, and the moment the boy settled against his father's chest, the golden glow pulsed brighter, then dimmed slightly. Emmerich made a small sound, the first sound he'd made in over a day, and his tiny fist closed around the collar of Soren's shirt. "Papa," he murmured, the word barely audible. Soren's face crumpled. He pressed his lips to the boy's forehead and closed his eyes, and Ceres watched the Alpha King of Valdren come undone. "I'm sorry," he whispered against his son's hair. "I'm sorry. I should never have sent you away. I should never have let you go." "You're trying to protect us?" Ceres said, and she didn't know where the forgiveness came from, only that it was there and it was real. "I was trying to protect you, and I nearly killed him." His voice was ravaged. "I nearly killed my son by doing the exact thing I blamed you for, pushing away the people I love, because I thought distance was the same as safety." Ceres's breath caught. "You love him." "Of course I love him. I loved him the moment I saw his face in that garden. I loved him before I knew his name." Soren looked at her and his eyes were raw and red and blazing with something that made her feel like the ground was falling away beneath her feet. "And I love you. I have loved you since you knocked that ink pot across your survey and yelled at me about elevation markers. I loved you when you left. And I loved you while I searched for you. And I loved you every single day of silence. And I am so tired of being too proud and too afraid to say it." Tears streamed down Ceres's face. "I told him stories about you. Every single night. I couldn't stop. I tried to forget you. And I couldn't, because you were in his face every time I looked at him. And he has your stubbornness, and your intensity, and your ridiculous habit of answering simple questions with 15-minute explanations, and I loved every single trace of you in him, because loving him was the only safe way to keep loving you." Soren crossed the room in 2 strides. Emmerich still cradled in one arm, and his free hand came up to cup her face. His thumb brushed the tears from her cheek. "Stay," he said. "One word, not a command. A plea." "I'm not going anywhere," Ceres whispered. "Not ever again." He kissed her softly, at first barely a brush of his mouth against hers, like he was asking permission. She answered by rising onto her toes and pressing into him, her hand gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. Between them, Emmerich stirred. The golden glow intensified, spreading from the boy's skin in rippling waves that lit the room like sunrise. The pressure in the air spiked, sharp and sudden. And Ceres gasped as she felt it. The boy's wolf, surging, straining, reaching for something it couldn't find. "Now," Ceres breathed against Soren's mouth. "It has to be now." She understood with a clarity that bypassed thought. The bond wasn't a decision. It was a door that had been waiting to open since the first night in the archive, since the first kiss in the rain, since the moment she'd felt his child move inside her, and known that she would never belong to anyone else. Soren's teeth found the curve of her neck, and the mating bite was instinct and intention, and years of longing compressed into a single searing point of contact. Ceres cried out, not in pain, but in recognition, and she bit him back, her teeth sinking into the muscle of his shoulder, claiming him as hers the way she should have claimed him long ago. The bond snapped into place. It was like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Warmth flooded her chest, her veins, her bones, golden and immense and alive. She could feel him, not just beside her, but inside her, woven into the fabric of her being. His heartbeat echoed in her ribs, his breath synced with hers. His love, enormous and fierce and terrified, poured through the bond like a river breaking through a dam. And then the resonance hit Imrich. The boy arched in Soren's arms, his small body going rigid, his mouth open in a silent cry. The golden glow blazed white. The air in the room compressed, then expanded, then compressed again, pulsing with the wild, unanchored force of a wolf that had been searching for its foundation since the day it was born. Saris grabbed Soren's hand. Their fingers locked together, the bond humming between them, and they both pressed close to the boy. Saris placed her free hand on Emrich's chest, felt the frantic thunder of his tiny heart, felt the wolf inside him thrashing, reaching, desperate. "We're here," she whispered. "We're both here. You're safe, little one. We've got you." The resonance of the completed bond flowed through their hands and into the boy. Saris felt it, a steadying pulse like a heartbeat beneath a heartbeat, wrapping around Emrich's wolf-like arms around a frightened child. The wild thrashing slowed, the pressure in the room eased. The white glow softened to gold, then amber, then a warm, gentle radiance that pulsed once, twice, 3 times in perfect rhythm with his parents' joined heartbeats. Then it faded. Emrich's body relaxed, his breathing deepened. His eyes, when they opened, were gray. Clear, calm, beautiful gray. "Mama," he said. "Papa." He looked between them with the drowsy confusion of a child waking from a fever. "I had a bad dream," Sarah sobbed. The sound tore out of her, raw and ugly and so full of relief it could have shattered glass. She pulled the boy against her chest and held him, and Soren's arms wrapped around them both, and for a long, trembling, infinite moment, the 3 of them stood in the king's chambers and held on to each other like the world outside didn't exist. Emrich fell asleep in minutes, truly asleep, peacefully asleep, his face soft and untroubled. The golden glow was gone. His wolf, for the first time in his short life, was still, anchored, grounded, safe. Soren carried him to the bed and laid him down with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart clench. He pulled the blanket up to the boy's chin, smoothed the curls back from his forehead, and stood there, looking down at his son, with an expression of wonder so pure it looked almost like pain. "He called me Papa," Soren said quietly. "He's been calling you that for weeks," Saris murmured, stepping beside him in his sleep. "When he thinks no one is listening." Soren made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. His arm came around her waist and pulled her against his side, and she leaned into him because she was exhausted and relieved, and because the bond between them was humming with a warmth that made everything else feel distant and small. "We made that," she whispered, looking at the boy. "You made that," Soren corrected. "Alone. Without help. Without me. You kept him safe with nothing but your own stubbornness and courage. I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to have been his father from the start." Saris turned her face into his shoulder and cried, not the desperate tears of fear and relief, from before quieter tears. The kind that come when something you've carried alone for too long is finally shared. They stood together over their sleeping son and let the bond settle between them. Warm and golden and irreversible, and outside the window, the sun climbed higher and the palace woke around them. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt possible. The bond didn't fix everything overnight. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt the same way it was first earned, slowly, through action rather than words. Through mornings that accumulated into weeks, and weeks that accumulated into months, each one laying another stone in the foundation of something that had nearly been destroyed before it could be built. Soren learned to be a father the way he learned everything, with fierce, relentless commitment and a complete refusal to accept failure. He read to Emmerich every night, even when council meetings ran late, and he had to whisper the stories through a yawn so wide Ceres could count his teeth. He sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, while his son built towers out of wooden blocks, and knocked them down and built them again. And he never once suggested that there was anywhere more important he needed to be. The first time Emmerich scraped his knee and ran to Sorin instead of Ceres, the king looked so startled and so profoundly honored that Ceres had to leave the room before he saw her laughing. The court adjusted, not gracefully and not without resistance. Harwick filed a formal objection to the mating and was overruled by the full council in a session that lasted 4 hours and ended with Fenric calmly suggesting that the councillor might find the climate in the southern provinces. Harwick took the hint. The noble families who had questioned the succession fell silent one by one, as it became clear that the Alpha King's mate was not going anywhere and that the king himself would sooner dismantle the court than compromise his family. Their wedding was small by royal standards. Ceres wore a dress that Orlaith had somehow produced from a locked trunk in the back of the infirmary, cream-colored and simple. And when she asked whose it had been, the old healer smiled and said, "Mine once, a long time ago. It's been waiting for someone worth wearing it." Sorin's vows were brief and direct, and exactly what she would have expected from a man who communicated love through action rather than poetry. "I will not send you away again," he said, holding her hands. "I will not choose safety over presence or duty over family. You are my family, both of you, and I choose you every day for the rest of my life." Ceres had prepared elegant vows. She forgot every word. "I'm staying," she said instead. "And if you ever try to put me in a carriage again, I will make your life very difficult." Fenric, standing as witness, nodded. "She will," the beta confirmed. Emmerich, seated in Marin's lap in the front row, because the old village woman had been invited and had arrived with a basket of preserves and a firm opinion about the quality of the palace's bread, clapped and shouted, "Red jam!" at a volume that echoed through the entire hall. The surges never returned. Emmerich's wolf, grounded by the resonance of his parents' bond, settled into a steady, healthy growth that Orlaith monitored with meticulous care and growing amazement. The power the boy carried was extraordinary, she told them one evening. Stronger than anything she'd seen in a child. Perhaps stronger than anything she'd seen at all. "He'll surpass you someday," Orlaith told Sorin. "Be ready for that." Sorin looked at his son, who was currently trying to convince a palace cat to wear a hat made of parchment, and smiled. Good. On a morning, months later, Ceres woke to pale light filtering through the curtains. Sorin was still asleep beside her, one arm draped across her waist, his face relaxed in a way she had once believed she'd never see again. Through the open door to the nursery, she could hear Emmerich talking to himself, a stream of consciousness monologue about dragons and breakfast, and whether cats could fly if you gave them wings. She lay still and let the moment hold her. The warmth of the bond humming in her chest, the sound of her son's voice, the steady rise and fall of her mate's breathing beside her. She had spent years running from this, years believing she wasn't allowed to have it. Ceres closed her eyes and pressed closer to the man she loved, and outside the window the sun climbed over the walls of Valdrin, and for the first time in a very long time, she was exactly where she belonged.